Jujutsu Kaisen is a series that has a lot of character deaths in it. Some are left ambiguous enough to speculate on a return or revival, and some are set in stone in order to let the readers know exactly how dire things are. But in this video, I want to talk about a character who exists in between these two states. A character who is neither fully dead nor alive, but someone that I'm very confident will be making a comeback in some form or fashion. Today, I will be talking about Megumi Fushiguro, and specifically why I think he'll be returning to Jujutsu Kaisen. When it comes to theorizing about future events in this manga, I try to be somewhat conservative in what I put my stocks into, simply because of Gege's unpredictability as a writer. But with the same confidence that I claimed Gojo had to lose to Sukuna, I will in this video be explaining why I think Megumi's return is vital to the story and established within the very core ideas of this series. I know this take is rather controversial amongst the community, at least in the circles that I personally find myself in, simply because Megumi for several months in real time hasn't been an active player in the story. Since Sukuna's possession and Sumiki's death, Megumi's screen time has dropped to nearly zero, which makes people think that he's already a lost cause. The first reason I disagree with this sentiment, though, comes from the characters within the story itself, as it has been heavily implied or outright stated on numerous occasions, even after being sunken completely into the abyss of evil, it should be possible to bring Megumi back. In chapter 220, Yuji and Yuta both say that they have ideas about how to help Megumi. Now, up to the point we are in the story currently, we as the audience aren't privy to the exact methods they have in mind, but it is made quite obvious that defeating Kinjaku and Sukuna, as well as saving Megumi, are all within the plans and expectations of these sorcerers. This claim gets followed up by the introduction of Yuki's research on souls, which may give us some level of insight onto how he can be saved from Sukuna. We'll circle back to the concept of the soul in relation to the body a bit later in the video, but keep that tucked away in the back of your mind for the time being. Now, it's certainly possible that Yuji and Yuta are simply characters that are unrealistic or optimistic, so much so that they can't be trusted as reliable sources on a topic as dicey as this one. Maybe you think Akotsu and Itadori respectively are blinded by their friendship with Fushiguro or general disposition towards comrades, and maybe that's clouding their judgment on the mission. Now, while I could somewhat accept this argument for Yuji, possibly so, I'd argue against this idea, at least for Yuta, by using the fact that we know Akotsu in particular was able to consider and genuinely weigh the options of Gojo potentially losing his life against Sukuna when it came to strategizing for the showdown. Even with Gojo being his teacher and the one who saved his life, probably being a significantly closer figure to him than Megumi, Yuta wasn't unwilling or unable to fathom his loss. During the events of the scuffle, we even see Akotsu doubting Gojo's ability to win numerous times throughout the fight. So to say that he can't take a step back from his emotions and at least attempt to objectively assess the situation is a rather baseless claim. So despite whatever innate desire to be positive or hope for the best that you think he may have, it's not like Yuta has been shown to be a particularly untrustworthy character to rely on in situations like this. If for some reason Yuji and Yuta's word wasn't enough, though, we see Megumi's revival or involvement in the series further being brought up by Gojo during his fight against Sukuna. In chapter 224, he talks about worrying about Megumi after killing Sukuna, and we get more insight into what exactly he means by this in chapter 229, as although it's brief, Gojo quickly mentions that he intends to bring Sukuna extremely close to death, likely in order to start the process of reviving or extracting Megumi, which we know because that's a callback to what Maki said in chapter 220 as well. And to take it one step further, even in death, Gojo seems to assume that Megumi will be reachable in some form or fashion, as he mentions that he left the whole ordeal of Toji and Megumi's relationship for Shoko to handle. With just the aforementioned pieces of dialogue, we have 5 to 6 different instances of characters making it clear not only that Megumi isn't a lost cause, but that they also specifically intend to save him as well. While you may be able to argue that Gojo has a uniquely soft place for Megumi in his heart, he's also been consistently demonstrated in the series to be a pragmatist, even making it explicit that he has no problem beating on and nearly killing someone who looks just like Megumi. When you consider all of these characters offering their analysis and speculation, and the fact that it all points in a similar direction, I think it would be silly to assume that retrieving Megumi is a complete impossibility. In fact, there's a very similar nature to the way Gege established the goal of unsealing Gojo and the goal of bringing Megumi's autonomy back. For quite a long time, it seemed like an impossibly high bar to clear that we had no way of knowing how to get past. But the North Star of retrieving their ally was always sitting in the back of the characters and audiences' minds. And despite the outcome of Gojo's fight with Sukuna, we do know at the end of the day that he was unsealed from Prison Realm. Just from a storytelling perspective, it wouldn't make sense for Megumi to be dead or unsalvageable in any capacity, at least without it being made known in plain terms. This idea bleeds directly into my next point of contention with people who think he's dead, or just the notion that all hope is lost for him. As to put it bluntly, nothing in the story implies Megumi is dead in the slightest, and I mean that quite literally. There isn't a single shred of evidence that leads to that idea. Fans of the series seem to do this quite often, but the conclusions that people have jumped to regarding Megumi are quite funny to see, especially when the actual source material makes it so blatant that they're wrong. You'll see someone say that Megumi is dead or cooked or unable to be saved, but we get confirmation that his soul and body are still intact. If Megumi's body were completely destroyed at any point in time, then the vessel that Sukuna needs to inhabit would simply cease to exist. The very existence of Sukuna within the story, at least in the humanoid form that he has now, necessitates that the vessel of Megumi lives on. And the blatant references to Megumi's soul in the Gojo vs Sukuna fight confirm that he's at least alive in that way as well. Upon Sukuna revealing his true form in chapter 237, many people thought this to be blatant confirmation that Sukuna had completely killed Megumi. And once again, not only is this an assumption based on absolutely nothing, but the story itself actually argues the opposite. Yorozu and Sukuna are the only two old sorcerers in the Culling games who have been explicitly shown, implied, or stated to have not fully incarnated immediately after their revival, meaning that Uro, Ishigori, Reggie, Kashimo, as well as every other incarnated player we've seen in the games thus far, are likely to have completely taken over the body of their hosts the moment they were revived, not grasping the potential to heal that holding off would grant them. This fact is crucial to understand because in chapter 199, Angel makes a few things clear that would now pertain to Megumi and Sukuna's dynamic. The first fact is that the incarnated players suppress the original body. They are never said to kill it. When this is said, Reggie, Kashimo, and Ishigori are shown as examples of this fact. If they are fully incarnated, which they are implied to be, this means that even in the most dire and extreme of cases, the original owner of the body should not be dead in the most conventional sense of the word. Logically, this should apply to Sukuna and Megumi in the same way that it does with all the other cursed objects. Knowing this, we can now safely assume that Sukuna's complete incarnation doesn't do anything more to Megumi than the position he was already in, because Sukuna already took steps to weaken his soul and suppress it as much as possible. The second important thing to note, the point that basically guarantees that Megumi, at least in theory, can come back and isn't certainly dead, is the fact that Angel knows that it isn't impossible to separate a cursed object and host body. While it's an extremely unlikely outcome, it isn't impossible, which is all you really need to argue to substantiate his continued existence. So long as it isn't impossible for Angel, or anyone for that matter, to remove a cursed object and its vessel, technically speaking, the vessel itself would have to be intact in some form or fashion. Now, up to this point in the video, my goal has been to establish two things, prerequisites to even having the discussion surrounding Megumi's eventual return. The first thing I set out to do was establish intent to save him on the protagonist part. Without that, it would be highly unlikely that Megumi gets out of the situation that he's in. The second thing necessary to really have this conversation is prove that Megumi can be saved in the first place, as even with all of the intent from our main characters, if logistically it's impossible to save him, it's just impossible to save him. No amount of desire or want would be able to overcome that barrier. I've established and substantiated both of those ideas to the best of my ability, and hopefully made it clear to everyone watching how rooted in objectivity these two things are. As far as we know, our main characters still aim to save Megumi, and based on every scrap of information we have regarding his soul, the incarnation of cursed objects, and Sukuna in general, he isn't dead quite yet. The component that I'm currently missing, however, is arguably the most vital to the entirety of this theory or speculation, and that's narrative purpose. Beyond the character's objective, beyond the viability of Megumi's return, when arguing that he will come back or really drawing a line in the sand for any theory in any series, what's really important is establishing a why. Not from the perspective of a character within the story, but on a more meta level than that. Why should the author make this decision? Why should Jujutsu Kaisen as a story do this? Why should Megumi come back? To answer that, I'm gonna need y'all to put on your nerd glasses, because it's time to take a look at the story and themes of Jujutsu Kaisen thus far. The story of Jujutsu Kaisen started by focusing on two characters and their relation to a finger. The first chapter of the manga is titled Ryomen Sukuna. The first page of this chapter shows Megumi looking for one of Sukuna's fingers. And the final pages of this chapter show Yuji consuming one of these fingers and a three-way conflict between Yuji, Megumi, and Sukuna. Now, for the sake of this video, my interpretation of this first chapter is rather lenient, or at least in this context, pretty specific to the theory I am laying out today. But I use this first chapter and interpret it in the way that I do because of how obviously important these three characters were intended to be from the start. Not just as individuals, but as pieces on the board to be moved around and influenced together. When you look at these three characters and all of their interconnecting messages, development, and importance to one another, you may understand why, narratively speaking, Megumi has to re-enter the story in some form or fashion to complete the circuit. Yuji and Sukuna can face off all they want, but without that third and final piece, you just have an incomplete puzzle. It's quite obvious to most fans of the series why Yuji and Sukuna specifically have such an obvious dynamic. It's obvious why he should be involved in the defeat of the strongest in history, and it's obvious why they basically hate each other, but not as many people see this same thing with Megumi. But when you really get into the weeds of it all, I would argue that Megumi's character journey is nearly as intertwined with Sukuna's as Yuji's is. The importance of the King of Curses to both Itadori and Fushiguro should not be understated at all, because it's largely in part due to him that these two characters have gone through so much suffering and growth. How Sukuna has done this for Yuji is rather self-evident for anybody who's read or watched the series, so let's take a look at Megumi's. Megumi's first on-screen mission concerned finding Sukuna's finger. His own personal whim and interference saved Yuji from being executed due to him being a vessel for Ryomen Sukuna. He fights this same King of Curses and garners his interest after running from a curse which bore his power, and Sukuna is a major reason that Megumi was able to shift his mindset and defeat another cursed spirit that possessed a part of him. This partial awakening impresses Sukuna, shows us a flashback of Megumi sitting on a pile of bodies in a similar fashion to him in his innate domain, and even in Shibuya, where Megumi and Sukuna don't personally interact all that much, Megumi summons Mahoraga to deal with Sukuna and limit his rampage, while Sukuna responds by saving Megumi because of his usefulness to his plan. Just this would be enough to argue that their narratives are very, very linked, but Gege takes it a step further by having Sukuna control Megumi's body and force him to kill Sumiki, Megumi's only reason for existing at this point, the crux of his morality and ideology as a sorcerer. For Megumi, you could look at Sumiki's death in the same way that Yuji viewed the massacre in Shibuya, or Nanami's death, or even Nobara's. Because of Sukuna, both Megumi and Yuji killed people and went strictly against their desires in a way that could never truly be reversed. Yuji killed dozens, if not hundreds of people in Shibuya, and while Megumi didn't kill nearly as many people that he cared about, he did kill two characters that he holds very closely in his heart, or at least two characters who are very fundamental to his development as a character, as a sorcerer, and as a human being: Gojo and Sumiki. While I don't think that Megumi ever looked at Gojo as a father figure or anything of the sort, I do think that he still cared, or at least appreciated, what Satoru did for him and his sister. And regarding that very sister, Megumi killed her as well, just like with Gojo, due to his own curse technique's efficiency. Saving people was the cornerstone of Yuji's philosophy, and Megumi's karmic justice mindset was predicated on his love for Sumiki and the unfairness of the world. Sukuna saw both of those things and completely defiled them. Sukuna hurt Yuji and Megumi in fundamental ways that may not ever be fixed. In almost every major instance of Sukuna or Megumi's journey throughout the story, the other person is there, or at least a relevant piece of the puzzle. We even have color pages in the story that imply Megumi's relationship to Sukuna either is or will be similar to Yuji's with Mahito. Aside from Yuji, Megumi is obviously the character who should hold the biggest grudge towards Sukuna and have the most desire to eliminate him full stop. Because of this, because of his potential, because of Sukuna's interference, I think Megumi is just as likely to play an integral part in Sukuna's downfall as Yuji. Yuji may play the larger part. Yuji may enter the fight significantly earlier than Megumi, but the entire story involving him, Yuji, and Sukuna up to this point can only truly come full circle if all three characters are at play. Megumi has saved Yuji. He kept him from dying just because of Sukuna and his evil. He implored Yuji to do the same for him in the Culling games, but Sukuna stopped that from happening immediately. What now needs to happen is quite obvious. Yuji needs to reciprocate. He needs to save Megumi. He needs to save him from Sukuna the same way that Fushiguro did for him all those months ago. This doesn't mean that Megumi or Yuji must live to the end of the story happily ever after, but it does mean that in whatever form it must happen, Megumi particularly will become an autonomous and useful ally once again. And it would certainly be interesting if Megumi's relation to Toji comes back in a big way, considering what his heavenly restriction meant for the body, the soul, and the relation between the two. When Sukuna first took over Megumi's body, many wondered why he was even strong enough or durable enough to be a vessel anyways, especially considering the fact that the likelihood of having that build was said to be 1 in a million, and the reason Yuji had it was because Kenjaku specifically built him to do such a thing. But what if some level of resilience was passed down from Toji to Megumi? It wouldn't grant him the same immense physical strength, speed, and sensory capabilities as a complete heavenly restriction, but being the son of Toji could possibly grant him a stronger body, one with the proper defenses to house Sukuna, and potentially even grant him a soul strong enough to resist the body and soul of another. This fact could be a blind spot for Sukuna even with Megumi's memories, because as you may remember, Megumi doesn't know who Toji is either. So I can very easily imagine the moment of realization for Fushiguro being quite the turning point in the struggle against Sukuna. Whether he and Sukuna fight for dominion over the body, or Megumi is somehow able to completely control it and fight from the outside, I'm not sure, but I can confidently say that Megumi will come back, and everything that I've said in this video explains why. This video was a long time coming for the channel, so I hope you all enjoyed it. For fellow Megumi fans like myself, I hope and expect this video to age like fine wine. And for all of the people who went into this skeptical or expecting his death, let me know how you feel about this theory and its reasoning now. I'm very curious if I changed your mind or if I've only entrenched you further in the Megumi skepticism. In any case, subscribe and hit the bell if you want to be notified when I upload. I hope you enjoyed the video, and I'll see you in the next one.